Okay, class, lecture number 23. We are moving along. You know that because I tell you that every time because I'm just as anxious to finish these lectures as you are. All righty, the last time we were together, we talked about the presidential election in 1960. Kind of controversial election, very close election there, but John Kennedy won that presidential election over Tricky Dicky Richard Nixon. All right, so John F. Kennedy, JFK, won that election here. Went through several other things here, the Bay of Pigs fiasco that took place in April of 1961. It tarnished the reputation of JFK, but he'll recover from that somewhat anyway. Berlin Wall goes up in August of 1961. We'll take it down next couple of lectures, but we still have a ways to go with that. Cuban Missile Crisis. 13 very, very tense days. Brinksmanship, that's what it was here. And finally, the Soviets, they were the first to blink. Or were they really? Because we likewise blinked at the same time here. We removed our nuclear missiles out of Turkey, and the Soviets agreed to remove their nuclear missiles out of Cuba. All right, then we went through the John F. Kennedy assassination. Had a little glitch there in the recordings there, and I apologize for that. I do the best I can. But when my camera cuts out, I don't know what to do about it except just redo it. That's the only thing I can do. And John F. Kennedy assassination, a very, very unfortunate part of our history. I encourage you to go to Dallas and explore this yourself, and draw your own conclusions with it. Lee Harvey Oswald, was he the sole assassin or was he not? I don't know. I don't think he was, quite frankly, here. In fact, many, many years ago, when I was your ages, I delivered my persuasive speech trying to convince my students in my speech class that it was a conspiracy and more than one individual involved. All right, Lee Harvey Oswald was the alleged assassin with that. And then we talked about JFK. LBJ, all the way with LBJ. That would be his campaign slogan, if you will, 1964. And LBJ had the Great Society. It was a very liberal program here, folks. We are still experiencing much of that to this very day. Election of 1964, which Lyndon Baines Johnson going against Barry Goldwater, and Lyndon Baines Johnson wins it in a landslide. All right, then we went into the Civil Rights Movement, which will be the majority of our lecture today here, and talk to you about Woolworths, the 4 teenagers, college students that were seated in a Woolworths lunch encounter in the whites-only section here. I think I mentioned to you about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. H. Rap Brown was associated with that, the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. And so let's get into today's lecture. And in 1961, CORE began a series of freedom rides. And what you're going to do here is you'll have supporters of the civil rights movement here will board Greyhound buses, Trailway buses, and travel through the South, trying to force integration in whites-only lobby areas, whites-only restrooms, whites-only lunch encounters. And anyway, they were known as freedom rides. And the people that participated in this, blacks and whites here, part of CORE, for many of them anyway, they were the freedom riders. And often this was met with violence as the buses would stop in places such as Anniston, Alabama, and white supremacists would torch the buses. Arrests were made, both sides here, so it was a crazy, crazy period of time. So I'm going to share some things with you from that period of time. Let's go to my camera here, go down below. And this is part of the Freedom Rides here of 1961. I can get my camera right here, and you can see a Greyhound bus there in Anniston, Alabama that's been torched. One of several people that were arrested with that. Here's another likeness here showing you the Freedom Rides. And 1961, another Greyhound bus there, that is being torched. That is in Anniston, Alabama. So it makes proud, it really does. And I say that facetiously, of course. All right, so let's move on here and see what else is going to happen here. And anyway, I'm down to this section here. In October 1962, there was a federal court order ordering that the University of Mississippi, that is Ole Miss, admit a man by the name of James Meredith as a student there. Now, James Meredith was an Air Force veteran. He served his country. He's an Air Force veteran, but he is African American. And Ole Miss at that time, fine institution. I love University of Mississippi. Like wandering around the campus there. Yeah, my daughter almost went to school there, but she ended up going to the University of Alabama, which I'm happy about that. But anyway, and a federal court order came in and ordered the governor of Mississippi, Ross Barnett, to order the admission of James Meredith as a student at the University of Mississippi. Most of you have not heard of that story before. I would dare bet you've not. Most of you are not even familiar with Governor Ross Barnett. I bet everybody that's listening to me, if you're listening to me, I bet you've heard of George Wallace, right? I bet you've heard of George Wallace, but nobody has heard of Ross Barnett. Now, if you go to Mississippi, he is kind of a legend in Mississippi. You'll find the Ross Barnett Reservoir, and I'm sure you'll find many, many other things there that are named for Ross Barnett around Jackson, Mississippi. All right, let's see what else happens here in Alabama in 1963. In April, Martin Luther King Jr., Ralph Abernathy, and Fred Shuttlesworth ordered a series of nonviolent protests. These were nonviolent protests in the downtown area of Birmingham, trying to force the integration here of luncheon counters. In particular, the demonstrations would take place at Kelly Ingram Park. The Birmingham Police Commissioner at that time was Eugene Bull Connor. Do not call him Eugene. He'll probably have you locked up for life. And I remember he's a white man, by the way, but I can remember being just a very, very frightened of Bull Connor. Everybody talked about Bull Connor. But for Bull Connor, he called out, called out the resources here, the Birmingham Fire Department, the Birmingham Police Department, the Alabama Highway Patrol got involved in this to break up these peaceful demonstrations. It was ordered by Martin Luther King Jr. And when the police came out, they used tear gas, cattle prods. The fire department used water cannons. German Shepherds, attack dogs, were brought in. Nightsticks were used in this too. I'll share a photograph with you here. And I remember all of this very, very well. These water cannons, by the way, will knock a person down and send them rolling down the sidewalk. I think there's a photograph in your textbook that shows you the fireman there, and it has proudly on the back there, BFD, Birmingham Fire Department. Once again, I said that facetiously. You can see protesters here. They're trying to take refuge away from those water cannons. Anyway, crazy, crazy. Here's a... In fact, I'm going to go back to my camera down below. I think you can see some of this better. Here's a photograph of that period of time. Little children were called out. And I'm talking about 12, 13, 14-year-old children were called out to Kelly Ingram Park and the streets nearby, to undergo these peaceful demonstrations. Here we go. Here, showing you once again some of the demonstrators. You can't see that very well. Involved in this. Hang on just a second. Try to find some other appropriate photographs. And please be patient with me. There is Ralph Abernathy, and this is Ralph Abernathy on this side. No, that's Fred Shuttlesworth. I'm sorry. That's Fred Shuttlesworth, Ralph Abernathy, Martin Luther King Jr., who was arrested during this peaceful protest. That's where he wrote his letter from Birmingham jail, by the way. And let's see what else might be appropriate for us to visualize in this. I'm going in the wrong direction here. There's a photograph of a young lady there down at the bottom who is experiencing one of the water cannons. We look up at the top here. This is a young black man right there. Notice he had German Shepherd. You can't miss a German Shepherd. The policeman there. But I want to tell you something. I always believe in telling the truth here. And what was happening here, you'll see this in many, many magazines or photos, that the policeman is, shall we say, sicking the German Shepherd on this young black man. And that is just not the case here. What was happening, you had some of the protesters that were taunting the dogs. They were running up into the face of the dogs. And then when a dog would lunge, then the protester would leap backwards. And that's what's actually taking place right here. But that's not the story we truthfully hear. All right, so anyway, that's the peaceful protests, nonviolent protests as advocated by Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. that took place at that period. All right, let's move on a little bit. And June the 11th, and 1963. You can hardly read the date there, but it's 1963. University of Alabama. University of Alabama, we all know that. Great institution, higher education. And I want to show you some things here with this. And in this, we're going to go back to me. I'm sorry, I have a lot of visuals today. Here we have George Wallace. George Wallace was the governor of Alabama. And on this date is where he stood in the schoolhouse door. Now, this is at Foster Auditorium, and what he wasn't really trying to prevent, but these two students here, Vivian Malone and James Hood, who will be the first African-American students to be admitted to the University of Alabama. And actually, I did not tell you the truth there, folks. They are recognized as being the first two African-Americans admitted, but there had actually been another student that had been admitted prior to this, and she dropped out of school. And I think she was harassed out of school of what it actually was here. But if we look at my article here, and you can see the photograph here of Governor Wallace standing in the schoolhouse door. The bald guy that is a federal representative here, Nicholas Kattenbrunner, I believe was his name anyway. And he walked up to Wallace and he just told Governor Wallace, he said, you're going to have to move out of the door of Foster Auditorium. Now, Foster Auditorium was a place in which students registered for the semester. And in fact, when I was a student at the University of Alabama, that is where I registered. I registered in Foster Auditorium. I actually walked through this same door right here. But anyway, most of you probably familiar with that story. And I want to show you the two students here. At least I can get it right, not upside down. And these are the two students here, actually who you're seeing there. That's Vivian Malone in the center, and Nicholas Kattenbrunner, I was telling you about a few minutes ago, the federal representative that is on her right-hand side. And I was looking for James Hood, a photograph of James Hood, and I must have just put that up, and I apologize for that. And so anyway, and for Governor Wallace just said, can you give me a minute? And he stood up to a microphone. I had a little platform there, a speaker stand, I mean to say, and he stood up to the microphone. He made a short political speech, and then he just stepped to the side. But anyway, that has been blown out of proportion for many, many years of George Wallace standing in the door of Foster Auditorium, and just much in this fashion right here, just like this, trying to prevent those African-American students from being admitted. That is not George Wallace. That is an imposter here, folks. That is an imposter. And if you go there today, they've created a little civil rights mini memorial there right outside of Foster Auditorium. That's where the Alabama basketball team, played basketball for many, many years before Coleman Coliseum was constructed there. Not very far from Denny Chimes. If you're at Denny Chimes there, you need to go a little bit to the southwest, and you can actually go down to where Foster Auditorium is located. Did you folks recognize that imposter? All right, on that very afternoon in Jackson, Mississippi, standing in the yard of his own home, Medgar Evers, who was an official with the NAACP, was shot dead. He was murdered. He was assassinated by Byron De La Beckwith. Who was a white supremacist here. And the movie Ghost of Mississippi was done based upon that scenario there. So let me catch you up here and let you take some notes with this so you can see Medgar Evers there, Foster Auditorium, Vivian Malone, James Hood. And by the way, Vivian Malone and James Hood did graduate from the University of Alabama. He died a few years ago, and I just did not bring that article out. I had it in my hand yesterday, and I should have kept it here so you folks could read about that. But anyway, Ghost of Mississippi, Byron De La Beckwith. All right, in response to this, John Kennedy, the President of the United States, now this is before his assassination, John Kennedy will introduce legislation that will prohibit segregation in places of public accommodation. All right, in August of 1963, the largest civil rights demonstration to that time will take place. 250,000 civil rights demonstrators, protesters, if you will gather in Washington, D.C. All right, and of course, this was where Martin Luther King Jr. made his very famous speech, I Have a Dream. Let's see if I wrote that down for you folks here. And there, largest civil rights demonstration, and I Have a Dream. This was done at the Lincoln Memorial, by the way. And I will show you a photograph here that taking place there. Now, this speech, by the way, I Have a Dream, if you were in my classroom, you could read this speech, and I have it on framed, if you will, in the back of the classroom. And some of you will be able to read this. I hope all of you will be able to read this. But anyway, the speech was not written by Martin Luther King Jr. It was not. It was written in part by a white man who was Jewish and communist, and it was written by a black man. So both of those wrote together and wrote this speech, I Have a Dream. Many people will give Martin Luther King credit for writing that speech, and that is just not the case here. All right, so that was that took place in 1963, by the way. Are any of you familiar, and this is an inappropriate time, I'm going to mention it anyway, are any of you familiar with the Million Man March? The Million Man March took place in October of 1995, and that was another civil rights demonstration here. They advertised it as 1 million people being present there in Washington, D.C., walking the streets and protesting for civil rights legislation here, extended rights, for minorities. And there was not 1 million men by any means. It was probably about 200,000 protesters here. And if you'll take a close look here and look me dead in the eyes, you can see a member of that Million Man March. You honestly can. You're looking at him right in the eyes here, folks. Well, let me kind of clarify that for a little bit. And I was present there in Washington, D.C. during the time in which the Million Man March was taking place. I'd gone to Washington. I was part of a 100th Division Army running team, and it was the Army 10 miler. It's the largest 10 miler in America, honestly. And I was part of that team. In fact, in 1995, we got second place overall in the Army Reserve Division, and we came back the next year and we got first place. First place in that. But anyway, I was just sightseeing downtown in Washington, D.C. during this ceremony and saw all these protesters walking by, and I just said, hey, why don't I act like I'm Forrest Gump and just jump right into the middle of this and walk along a little bit, So I actually did set foot in the Million Man March. I didn't even buy the T-shirt, by the way, and I walked just a little bit, and then I stepped out and went back to my sightseeing. It's much more entertaining. All right, unfortunately, we're going to see a tragedy to take place, and this will occur in Birmingham, Alabama, September the 15th, 1963, 16th Street Baptist Church. That is the site of the Civil Rights Museum in Birmingham, and I'll tell you more about the National Civil Rights Museum at a later time, but not today anyway. And white supremacists detonated a bomb. It was in the basement area of the, you might call it the first floor, but it was like in the basement area of the 16th Street Baptist Church. During Sunday school, by the way, and 4 young girls were killed. Several others were injured here. These girls, by the way, I'll go back to myself here. And these girls, you can read their names right here. We had Addie Mae Collins here, Cynthia Wesley, there's Denise McNair, and Carol Robertson. Those are the 4 girls that were killed. All right, and that was a very, very unfortunate event that took place. Those girls, by the way, 3 of the I think all of them are buried in Greenwood Cemetery. That cemetery is a cemetery that is right next to the Birmingham Airport and Birmingham International Airport. And I've been in this cemetery, found 3 of the grave sites for those young ladies there. I couldn't find the 4th one. And you might say, well, why in the world is he wandering around the cemetery looking for grave sites for little girls? I just happened to have a flight that was out of Birmingham. I had a couple hours delay with that flight, and I just went over to the cemetery and just wandered around until I found graves. So anyways, a tragic occurrence there. So let's go back here. All right. And as we move on into the next year, in the summer of 1964, and what is referred to as Freedom Summer, and there were thousands of these, shall we say, freedom workers that were in Mississippi and other areas of the South, and what they were trying to do was to register qualified voters. And 3 of these freedom workers were killed, during this Freedom Summer. Near Philadelphia, Mississippi. You can go to the site if you wish to do so, if you can tear yourself away from the casinos that are present there. And 3 of those freedom workers were killed by white supremacists. Later they made a movie about this, which is called Mississippi Burning, which is based upon that happening right there. 2 of those freedom workers were white and 1 was black. Did I write their names out for you here? Maybe I did. And I apparently did not do that. Okay. So anyway, all right, let's move on here. Now I want to go into March of 1965. We'll be away from this subject shortly here. In March of 1965, in an event which is called Bloody Sunday. Bloody Sunday. Now, if you were taking my Western Civilization class, I'll tell you about another event, Bloody Sunday, that took place in St. Petersburg, Russia. But that's not what I'm talking about. We're talking about Bloody Sunday that occurs in Selma, Alabama. All right, Bloody Sunday. Now, most of you are familiar with part of this story, but you're probably not familiar with the true story here. So let me help you out with this. Now, on March the 7th, and pay attention to the dates, on March the 7th of 1965, 600 demonstrators, they were led by Hosea Williams and John Lewis. Some of you may be familiar with John Lewis. He recently passed away. He had a position in Congress for many, many years, a congressman from Georgia. And anyway, those two individuals were leading a protest. And the Selma Sheriff, Jim Clark, and Alabama Highway Patrol with sheriff's deputies just set in upon these demonstrators, and it was just a bloody, bloody, brutal affair. Now, that is what is referred to as Bloody Sunday. Now, let's go 2 days in the future. And 2 days in the future, this would bring us up to March the 9th, in 1965, a second march started. Same fashion right here. But this time, the march was stopped because the demonstrators had no parade permit. All right, stay with me on this. And then the third protest is going to take place, and this, doing it right now, with a parade permit on March the 21st. This is 2 weeks after the first Bloody Sunday, and 1965. And this time they were led by Martin Luther King Jr. He had his wife with him, Coretta, 4,000 demonstrators, and they were escorted this time by the Alabama Highway Patrol. 2 weeks earlier, the Alabama Highway Patrol had inflicted damage upon these protesters, and they crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge. That crosses the Alabama River in Selma. And you've probably seen photographs of that, and I should have brought a photograph out for you to witness that anyway. But if you go to Selma, Alabama, and as a historian, I would recommend that you go. It's a very, very poor area, but you can go there, and if you wish to do so, you can walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. I've done it before. And anyway, and I'll tell you more about that in just a few seconds here. And once they crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, then the idea was to march to the 50 miles to Montgomery, Alabama. Well, I will tell you that only about 300 actually walked the 50 miles. 4,000 went across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, but most just after that just dropped out. And then about 300 actually did. It took them several days to get to Montgomery, Alabama. And when they were going up Dexter Avenue towards the Alabama State Capitol, the old State House building there, and Governor Wallace was in his office at that time, and about 30,000 other protesters jumped in for the last half mile. So when you look at photographs of this, you'll see 30,000 people going through the streets of Montgomery, Alabama, and then the caption will tell you that these 30,000 people walked from Selma and 50 miles into Montgomery. And folks, that's fake news right there. You had about 300 that actually did the distance, and then the remainder of the 30,000 jumped in for the last mile. My dad at that time happened to be in Montgomery, Alabama, and witnessed all of this. My dad was in Governor Wallace's office right when this was taking place, and he described it. He said the governor and his entourage, his cabinet members, whatever it is, said they were all very, very concerned with this because they thought that the protesters were actually going to enter into the State House, into the Capitol itself, and go up and do something to the governor. I don't know. And you might ask, why was my dad there? Well, at that time, my dad was president of Walker College, and he was down in Montgomery lobbying to get money for our private college of Walker College. And he was seated in the office with Governor Wallace. He knew Governor Wallace very, very well. Governor Wallace would come to Jasper on a rather frequent basis with that. Dynamic speaker, by the way, too. And so anyway, and that's the end of the story with that. But I want to set you straight there on Bloody Sunday and the march into Selma. All right, let's move on here, folks. I apologize for getting choked up with that. In 1965, the country passed, the president signed civil rights legislation, and it was referred to as the Civil Rights Act, or most people referred to it as the Voting Rights Act, which would prevent discrimination, in places of polling, places of voting. It was also during this period of time that we developed a policy which was called affirmative action. It was not very popular with many, many Americans here, and what it was with affirmative action is that institutions would take positive measures to recruit minorities, particularly that of blacks. So instead of a position being determined, the person that's hired being determined by taking a civil service test, then you would find that African Americans or minorities would be given priority over a person that probably scored higher on an examination. So you can do a little thinking on that. Was it popular? Not with some people, not with some people in our country at that time. All right, so let's move on here. Well, during this period, we're going to see a number of urban riots. I told you the last time we were together in America in the 1960s, I just didn't think things could get any worse. And every day that you got up, it seemed like things got worse. And we're going to see something in 1964, 1965 that was even worse than what we have been currently witnessing in 2015 and 2020 here, folks. Riots would take place, these urban riots, protests. 1964 in Harlem, and Harlem, of course, is in New York. Serious urban protests took place here in 1965 in the Watts district of Los Angeles, and this was just unbelievable here. 10,000 protesters. The National Guard was called out with 34 people that were killed. Most were African Americans, some were whites with that. And I'm telling you folks here, this was barbarism. It all happened when a white policeman struck a black bystander with a nightstick, with a billy stick. And that's what generated the protest. Protesters were going into the streets, dragging motorists out of their cars, beating them senselessly, setting fires to buildings, shooting at policemen, shooting at firemen. It was chaos. It was chaos. It was barbarism. And the following year, in 1966, we had 43 major race riots, the worst of which was Chicago and Cleveland, 1967, 8 major race riots, the worst of which was Newark, New Jersey, Detroit, Michigan. For many people here, and I never did tell you a few minutes ago about my story here in Selma. So I'm going to get away from this for a second and let me go back to my story in Selma. I forgot about that, folks. I told you about my participation in the Million Man March, but I actually participated in a march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. I did so. This was in 2016. I'm a historian, you know that. And I knew that Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton, and this was during the campaign of 2016, and 2008, not 2016. And I knew that Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama and Jesse Jackson were supposed to be in Selma, Alabama. And so I packed up, I went to Selma, and sure enough, I got to see Hillary Clinton. I heard a couple of speeches that she made, and I heard a couple of speeches that Barack Obama made at that time. And Bill Clinton, he was just very charismatic, just always fooling around, joking around with the people. He was the guy that was stealing the show with that. But of all the speeches I heard, and the best 2 speeches I heard was by Al Sharpton. I'm not kidding. And I'm no Al Sharpton fan by any means here, but he was the one that delivered the very best speeches. And then after it was all said and done, there was a march that was going to take place across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And sure enough, the Clintons and Barack Obama jumped into the processional to go across the bridge, and I thought, well, why not me? And so I jumped into that procession and just marched right along with those individuals. Other than Bill and Hillary Clinton, I was the only white person that I saw there. Honest, that's the truth here. So nobody bothered me whatsoever in that protest. I have no reason to believe that they would bother me, but I left unscathed, went back to my car. My car was completely unharmed, and I looked on the back of my windshield there, and there was a Support George W. Bush sign that I placed there. I thought, oh my goodness, how could I be so stupid with that? But nobody bothered me whatsoever. All right, so enough of that nonsense. So let's go back to our camera and see what else is going to take place. Okay, so during this period of racial awareness, if you will, we're going to see the emergence of black power, the symbol for black power. And what jogged my memory on that is when I was in 2008 down in Selma, some of the people that were present there began chanting black power, and the others there, and I'm talking about 99.5% of them, hushed them. And told them, we don't want that. We don't want that to take place. So for many African Americans, they became aware of their roots. Alex Haley wrote this book, which was called Roots, Kunta Kinte, who had been taken as a slave and brought to the New World. It became quite fashionable to wear the Afro hairstyle that was popular at that period of time. It was always funny to me to see whites that did the same thing. I don't know why it would be funny, but it just looked kind of peculiar here. The Black Panther Party would emerge from this period of time, and I'll share this with you. It came out of Oakland, California. Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, these were both radicals. Both were convicts here. I think it was Huey Newton was accused of killing a man. I believe Bobby Seale was too here. And we can see in this likeness here showing you some of the Black Panthers openly brandishing assault weapons here, cross bandoleros of ammunition across their chest, going through the streets of some of these major cities here. These were Black Panthers. I wonder what would happen to me if I had you folks here to put cross bandoliers of ammunition and arm ourselves with M16s and AK-47 rifles and go down the streets of Jasper. I wonder what would happen to us. Well, I can only imagine what would happen to us at that time. But that was just a part of this movement here in the 1960s. All right, another group here, or I should say another faction, is going to emerge. It's called the Nation of Islam. These are the black Muslims. And it was organized, if you will, by Elijah Poole in 1931. Most people don't realize that the black Muslims organized in 1931. And Elijah Poole changed his name to Elijah Muhammad. Now, one of the individuals that's so closely identified with the Nation of Islam is that of Malcolm Little. Now, he was a former drug addict. He was a convict. He was a pimp. And he changed his name to Malcolm X to represent his lost surname. Here's a likeness here of Malcolm X. If you were in my classroom, I have a framed photo of Malcolm X in the back of the classroom. There he is on the opposite side where my finger is tapping right there. And on the streets in New York, in 1965, he was murdered. He was shot dead, and you can see the photograph there. And shot dead. There's evidence to lead us to believe that it was thugs from Louis Farrakhan that actually did this. I cannot prove that, but I think I'm probably right with that too. So that is Malcolm X. All right, so shall we move right along here, folks? Aren't you having fun with this? This is an important part of U.S. history. It honestly is. Okay, oops, I missed something here, so let's go back here to this one. Kind of get things straightened up here so that we can read this. Okay, before we leave it entirely, for many of the prominent African Americans at that time, they would join the black Muslims and Nation of Islam, change their name. Cassius Clay, I can remember when Cassius Clay fought, boxed, if you will, under the name of Cassius Clay. But he changed his name to Muhammad Ali. He avoided the draft. And anyway, Lou Alcindor, who changed his name to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Okay, so let's move on here, folks. We've got a lot of things to cover here. Not so much today, because we will continue this in our next lecture, which will spend almost the entire class period talking about Vietnam. All right, now George F. Kennan, Mr. X, which we talked about at an earlier time, said that Vietnam was the worst and most tragic event that took place during the history of the United States here. And I will tell you here, in Vietnam, the United States is going to be indirectly involved in Vietnam for about 25 years, from about 1950 to about 1975. Now, militarily, we're going to be involved in Vietnam from 1965 to 1972. I've got a lot to tell you about this, too. And for the United States, we didn't just go to war. We were just kind of sucked into this war at that time. All right. Now, I need to give you a little background on this. Vietnam had been a former province of China. It is located right south of China. It had a long history of warfare, about 2,000 years of intermittent warfare. In the middle 1800s, the French came in, and the French colonized this area and took it over. And this would include the areas of what we have today as Vietnam and Laos, Cambodia, Thailand. It was referred to as French Indochina. And when World War II broke out, the Japanese came in. And the Japanese just took this area over in just a matter of weeks. And for the United States, we're going to spend years and years trying to secure all of that area, and we're going to be unsuccessful. But the Japanese, they were successful with this. Now, resisting the Japanese was an organization which was called the Viet Minh. You can see it right here. That's what they were known as. It was the Viet Minh. And the Viet Minh were led by an individual by the name of Ho Chi Minh. He who enlightens. He who enlightens. And here is a likeness here at the top of Ho Chi Minh. Here he is again. And in fact, you can even see, this is Ho Chi Minh right here. And that's one of his most trusted generals, Vo Nguyen Giap. Vo Nguyen Giap. Maybe I wrote his name out for you. And if I did, I'll point it out to you if we go through the slides right here. And my friends, if you're in Vietnam, you're in the land of the little people. You honestly are. I've had a number of Vietnamese students in my class. They were all excellent students. And I'm not a very tall person. So I stand 5'8" if I stretch myself a little bit. But the Vietnamese students that I had all came to about my chin. So it gave me kind of a good feeling, because it's seldom that I actually look down on people. I'm mostly looking up at people. So anyway, and that's Ho Chi Minh. And when World War II was over and the Japanese surrendered, the Viet Minh under Ho Chi Minh wanted their independence. In fact, they developed a Declaration of Independence, which was very similar to the one we have in our country. But France wanted to regain control of that area. And reluctantly, France did. And I say reluctantly by other countries, and certainly by the Viet Minh, France did regain control with that. So this is going to begin the first war, the first, shall we say, Indo-Chinese war. And it's back and forth. We had the French on one side, we had the Viet Minh that are on the other side with that. But in May of 1954, the French found themselves surrounded at a place in the very, very northern parts of Vietnam, northern Vietnam. And Vietnam at that time was not divided. And the French were defeated at a battle which is called Dien Bien Phu. Dien Bien Phu. And it was a magnificent campaign. If you want to read about it here, the forces, the Viet Minh forces were led by Vo Nguyen Giap, the guy I mentioned to you a few minutes ago, the little guy with that. And the Vietnamese, the Viet Minh, they were like fire ants. It honestly was. And they ended up just surrounding the French. There was no way out for the French, and the French was requesting assistance from the United States, military assistance. And the United States, under Eisenhower, we refused to get involved, and I'm glad we did not get involved. All right, let's go back to the map here, and put a map of Vietnam. It's more appropriate for the next time that we get together. But here's Vietnam. It's a tiny, tiny country. It's a third world country. This is Vietnam here. We represent this as South Vietnam. This is North Vietnam. And where that engagement took place at Dien Bien Phu was right here. It was right up here. It was right on the corner there of Laos. You cannot go there today, by knowledge anyway. Here is Hanoi, that is present here, Haiphong. These are places that I'll be mentioning to you very, very shortly here. All right, so that's the situation that we had there in 1954 following Dien Bien Phu. All right, so what's going to happen here? A decision is going to be made at the Geneva Convention to divide Vietnam on the 17th parallel. And divide Vietnam 1 year. And here's where the division would take place. It's on the 17th parallel, which is right there. All right, so let's go back to my camera here, and let's see what else we got to mention with that. All right, so Vietnam, going to be divided on the 17th parallel for 1 year. Now, the reason for this is that in the next year, which will be 1956, the Vietnam was divided in 1955, is that an election would be taken, and the election would determine who will be the leader of a unified Vietnam. And the 17th parallel will no longer serve as the boundary there. All right, so there, I caught you up there. Now, leading the North Vietnam, is Ho Chi Minh. He who enlightens. His real name is Nguyen Ai Quoc. Nguyen the Patriot. And the leader of South Vietnam was this individual, Ngo Dinh Diem. Ngo Dinh Diem. Now, I want you to remember that. You need to remember both of these individuals here. And Ngo Dinh Diem. Now, in Vietnam, in Vietnamese, this name, where am I here? This name here is your first name. This is your first name. So his last name is Go. His last name is Go. His first name is Diem. So it's Go Din Diem. That's what he is referred to as. And his brother's name is Nu Din Diem. And I know this sounds funny and you're probably laughing about that. And these were progressive individuals. They were both Catholic, and this is in a Buddhist country. This is a Buddhist country, and they're Catholic. Now, I'll show you a photograph very quickly here of Go Din Diem. And notice here in the back seat of this car here, right here, this is Go Din Diem, present there. This is President Eisenhower. President Eisenhower, this photograph, by the way, was taken in Washington, D.C., at one of the airports in Washington, D.C. All right, so I'll mention him once again, Go Din Diem. He was considered to be the Churchill of Southeast Asia. All right, educated individual, had expensive taste there. Okay, so let's move on for a few minutes. In when the election was supposed to take place in 1956, it did not take place. And the reason for this is that everyone knew that Ho Chi Minh would have won that election. So it was easier just to not have the election and keep Vietnam divided. So it's going to remain divided there on the 17th parallel all the way up until 1975, by the way. By 1959, the National Liberation Front was organized, and by the following year, in 1960, they began to undergo military operations in South Vietnam. All right, that's in 1961. And by 1961, and by the way, the National Liberation Front, that's the official name for it, but unofficially they are referred to as the Viet Cong, or the VC, the Victor Charlie, Viet Cong. And in 1961, the Viet Cong had killed over 4,000 government officials. Now, what happens here is that the Viet Cong would work in the villages mostly, in the jungles. They would work there, and they would go into these jungles here, jungle villages, and kill the leader, if you will, what we would call the mayor of the village, and threaten the people, and the people would, of course, have to support communism and support the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong were communists. Very elusive individuals. They would wear maybe black pajamas, black-looking pajamas, but they might just wear just ordinary clothing. So you did not know who the VC actually were. Quite active at night here, undercover, if you will, working in the villages to maintain control there. Now, in the large cities, we'll find that the South Vietnamese government, largely anyway, under Go Din Diem, will actually control that. So I'll say it once again, the villages are controlled by the communists of VC, and the cities are largely controlled by the shall we say, pro-democracy group under Diem. And he used his brother Nu, and Nu was in charge of security and the police forces there, and he was absolutely brutal to people that opposed him. All right. So anyway, well, as it turned out, and this was so crazy, and I did not bring out a photograph of this, and I should have. I'm looking around quickly. If I see one during the next lecture, I'll bring that out to you. And I just happen to have this right next to it here. And what happens here in the large cities, these Buddhist monks would begin demonstrations and go out into the streets, cities of Saigon or Hue or Da Nang, places such as that, and they would immolate themselves. What I'm talking about, go down, sit down in the middle of the street there, cross-legged, if you will, cross your arms. An associate would come up behind you and pour 5 gallons of gasoline on your body, and then the Buddhist monk would flick his bick, if you understand what I'm talking about, a cigarette lighter, and just immolate himself there. Now, that was martyring yourself for your cause. I just happened to find this. Let's get the light adjusted properly here, and we can see a couple of those immolations that are taking place here in the streets of whatever city that is. Here's another one taking place right there. All right, so anyway, and for the American people that are seeing this, and we're seeing these immolations take place on the nightly news, and also for the Kennedy administration, we're thinking, what the heck is going on over there? I thought that Diem had control of the place. I thought that Go Din Diem was in full control. And as it turns out, there was a lot of opposition to him. It didn't help matters that Nu's wife, they called her the Dragon Lady, she was referring to these immolations as crispy critters, and that certainly didn't sit well in the eyes of the public there. So anyway, the CIA developed a plan for a coup against Go and Nu. And sure enough, they orchestrated this with some of the South Vietnamese generals. And shortly before the assassination of John Kennedy, after the CIA approved this coup against them, go and knew the Dim brothers were assassinated. All right, and I cannot, well, I could, but I don't want to tell you the succession of new leaders in South Vietnam, because, my friends, it is just one after the other, after the other, after the other. And will be the president, if you will, of South Vietnam for a period of time, be assassinated, we'll get another one assassinated, and it was just a mess. All right, now I'm going to leave with this, but I got to tell you about this. In August of 1964, and I don't even know if this happened, but in August of 1964, two United States destroyers, the Sea Turner Joy and the Maddox, they were attacked. They were attacked by North Vietnamese patrol torpedo boats, and they were attacked. They were fired upon by these North Vietnamese torpedo boats. Did that take place, or did it not? I don't know. I really don't know, but there's a lot of historians that believe that this was just a fabrication, that the Sea Turner Joy and the Maddox were supposedly fired upon. And nonetheless, the President of the United States, Lyndon Baines Johnson, will use that alleged attack to go to the houses of Congress and get a resolution which is known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, or the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, as some people refer to it as. This will give the United States forces in Vietnam the authority, if you will, to protect themselves, to use measures, to use means to protect themselves against the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. Now, please take note of this. In August of 1964, in the House of Representatives, supporting the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, in other words, the United States can go to war in South Vietnam, it passed by a vote of 416 to 0. There's not an opposing vote for the United States to get ourselves involved in Vietnam. In the Senate, the vote was 88 to 2 in favor of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. So I hope that you will agree with me by now. We now have the authority from the President and authority from Congress to enter into Vietnam and get ourselves involved in this futile, unnecessary war to protect South Vietnam from communism. Now, the next time we get together, we're going to see how rapidly the United States forces build up in Vietnam. So I'm going to close for right now here, folks, and we'll go into Vietnam in our next lecture, lecture number 24. All right, thank you very much.